Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cipher Brief. I'm Ethan Masukal. Today, we're going to be talking about a rather last-minute deal that the Biden administration put through. He dropped Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, lifted some financial restrictions, all in exchange for the release of some political prisoners and those that the U.S. deems wrongfully detained. Here to talk about that deal is Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ryan, thank you very much for joining us.
Ethan, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
First reactions to the deal, as one official described it, is an act of goodwill. So, what's your response to this?
Well, I think that we've heard murmurings for a long time about the Biden administration changing the posture of the United States towards Cuba. We haven't really seen many moves in that direction, and this is finally a move in that direction. But I think it's come, too little, too late to actually have any policy impact, and I suspect that this policy will be reversed pretty quickly into the Trump administration. In fact, incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has said that this is going to be likely reversed once they get into office. I also think there are various elements of this, Ethan, that are just bad policy. There are reasons for keeping Cuba on the state sponsor of terror list, but there are also reasons to question what the Biden administration has gotten in return for this removal of the state sponsor of terror label.
Right. So, let's break down the details of the deal a bit. So, the big headline thing is that Cuba is being dropped from that list of state sponsors of terrorism. One administration official said, "There is no credible evidence of ongoing support by Cuba to support international terrorism." So, is that accurate? Is it appropriate that Cuba was taken off the list?
So that's a very controversial point, and it's not exactly as clear cut as the administration official would like it to be. The Cubans have nurtured throughout their history many revolutionary movements that the United States considers to be terrorist organizations within Cuba, and also financed and funded them abroad. Perfect example is the National Liberation Army, or the ELN, in Colombia. There's a reason that Gustavo Petro, the current president of Colombia, is negotiating now with that group through intermediaries in Cuba. Why are they negotiating in Cuba? Because for a long time, Cuba was the greatest patron of the ELN. That's just one example of a guerrilla group that Cuba has spawned, funded throughout their years. Cuba is a revolutionary regime. It sees it as its responsibility to fund and support other ideological movements that share some of its principles and tenets. So I would argue that part of Cuba's revolutionary ideology is supporting these types of groups wherever they spring up. That in itself makes Cuba an occasional sponsor of state terror, using state resources to support some of these groups wherever they pop up in the hemisphere.
The other aspect of this deal is the easing of some financial restrictions, some of which were imposed in the first Trump administration. What impact do those have?
So there are some banking restrictions that come along with being on the state sponsor of terror list. There are some ways in which U.S. development assistance can't be deployed when you have an SST designation. The other part of this deal, Ethan, is that the Biden administration has decided through executive action to suspend an element of a piece of legislation called the Helms-Burton Act, which was passed in the 1990s. It allowed Cubans, Cuban Americans, and Americans who had property expropriated under the Castro regime in Cuba to be able to sue in courts, in U.S. courts, for some kind of reparation on that expropriation. And the specific title that is involved here is Title III. And so what the Biden administration has done is suspended those lawsuits under Title III, which means that any of the companies, any of the families that owned companies that were expropriated, or critical pieces of infrastructure expropriated, those cases have essentially been frozen, it's my understanding. And those are not moving forward now.
So those are the aspects of the deal sort of for the Cuban side. And in exchange, there's the release of those political prisoners and those that the U.S. Thinks are unjustly detained. What is your reaction to that part of the deal?
Well, I think we should always celebrate when unjustly detained persons in highly authoritarian countries like Cuba are released. I do, however, have a problem, Ethan, with the way in which the dropping of the SST, the state sponsor of terror designation, has been linked to the release of political prisoners. The political prisoners shouldn't have been taken in the first place. And part of being a state sponsor of terror, one of the things that you do repeatedly is you take prisoners or hostages in order to negotiate with other governments. That's part and parcel of getting yourself on this list. And so I do worry that we've incentivized the taking of more prisoners in order to get off lists, in order to get certain designations dropped, certain restrictions dropped. The other thing that I've noted is the Cuban government has said that this will be a very slow release of the
Mm,
prisoners. It's not a release en masse of the prisoners. And so what the Biden administration has done is effectively tied the hands of the Trump administration when they come in, lest they be responsible for not getting the full prisoner release from Cuba. So if the Trump administration decides early in the administration to reverse this policy, they stand at risk of being accused of not following through on a policy that could have gotten more than 500 unjustly detained people released. And so I fear as well it kind of ties the hands of the incoming administration on Cuba, strictly because they wouldn't want to be responsible, of course, for 500 people not getting the release that they had been promised as a part of this deal.
right. So that is a dilemma for the incoming Trump administration. As you said, they're tied. Their hands are tied with this deal, but then already members of the Trump team have said they want to reverse this deal. So, what do you think the incoming Trump administration is actually going to do?
Well, I think the incoming Trump administration is going to focus heavily on the Americas. They've said as much. They've also put in key personnel positions the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, people who understand the Western Hemisphere very well, and people who have been noted hawks on countries like Cuba,
Right.
Venezuela, Nicaragua. So I think that this policy is going to be reversed very quickly in the Trump administration. And you may see a reversal as well of other policies on sanctions, on certain elements of the embargo, on the restrictions that were in place in the first Trump administration on the level of remittances that Cubans, say in Florida, could send to their family still residing on the island, mostly out of concern that the military takes a cut of all of those remittance payments. Those are the types of things that I would anticipate us seeing again. In other words, going back to a posture and a set of policies that looks pretty similar to what Trump 1.0 policy looked like on Cuba. The last thing I would say, Ethan, is that there's probably even more incentive to go to that kind of policy because what we've seen in the last couple days, even, is yet another intelligence agency within the intelligence community of the United States come to the conclusion that Havana syndrome is real and that there was some kind of weapon that was used against US diplomats or experimented on US diplomats in ways that will get, I think, further negative coverage, further negative attention, let's call it, of Cuba from the incoming administration.
We've covered Havana syndrome a lot in Cipher Brief, so we've been talking about Cuba for a while, and I feel that we're going to be talking about Cuba long into the future. So, thank you very much, Ryan.
Thanks for having me, Ethan.